Great.
Yeah, I just wanted to start by saying I really appreciate you coming on. You're someone I've looked up to for a long time, and we were lucky enough to have met almost about a year ago at the intensive, and
Hmm.
and yeah, so like I said, I really appreciate you coming on and
Hmm.
sharing your wisdom.
Absolutely. No, thanks very much for having me. You want me to kind of get going here, start sharing my screen, or introduce myself? What do you want to do, Alex? What's the best way to do this?
Whatever works for you. If you want to introduce yourself
Great.
and share your screen,
Awesome.
go right through it.
Yeah,
Or
sounds good. So welcome everybody. Thanks very much for showing up. It means a lot to me anytime someone comes to see me speak. Honestly, it means a lot. My family never listens to me, so to have other people that don't even know me listen to me is great. Maybe we'll see what happens afterwards. And I'm particular in the middle of your day. I mean, I know it's 2 o'clock on a Thursday where I am, and I'm sure it's right in the middle of people's days. So, if you took time out of your day seeing clients or scheduling stuff, thanks very much for taking the time out. Hopefully we'll make it worth your while. One quick question as well, Alex, is there going to be Q&A at the end too? Are there going to be people posting questions that I go at the end?
yeah, so if it's okay with you, like at the end, the last
Yeah.
10-15 minutes, I was thinking
Yeah.
like you just open it up and people can ask questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I won't get to them as we go along, but if you got questions as we're going along, feel free to kind of put them in there, and I'm happy to kind of go through them at the end, kind of like we did with the Perform Better. Again, my name is Michael Mullen. For those of you that don't know me, probably most of you, I've been in the industry of physical therapy, rehabilitation, training for 30 some odd years, and I feel fortunate to have learned a lot of really great things over the years. A lot of really smart people and models and industries and institutes that I've learned from. I am an avid reader and thinker, and so I'm constantly educating myself and trying to figure out, what's going on with this structural thing we call the human body. I just had a fascinating conversation with this pastor that I just treated outside, and I love the dialogue and conversation. And the topic I'm going to talk about today should, kind of reflect some of the things that you've been learning about in Alex's mentorship, which is going to be a lot of fun. My background was rehabilitation and physical therapy for many, many years, but I started delving into the performance and training side of things when I realized that was not a complete model, and that I wanted people to be more active and really introduce strength, power, confidence building in their rehabilitation programs. So I have my own business. I've been on my own for about 5 years. It's called Integrative Rehab Training. And it's just, I see clients one-on-one across a broad spectrum. I work with everything from, professional athletes and high-level people who have, injuries, ailments, and problems, to people who, really have a lot of issues, chronic pain, have been to a bunch of different, practitioners and just haven't had success. I definitely, as Alex knows, we're like-minded. We look at the body differently, and Matt, we look at the body differently, and this comprehensive way that we look at things has provided a lot more answers and solutions to people than I ever would have had with the models that I learned from. So hopefully today, when we talk about stuff, looking at things from the inside out, if you would, hopefully that will help to kind of fill in some blanks as well too with some of the things you've been learning. So I'm going to go to share my screen here. Give me a second. Okay, let me make this big. Got that. How am I doing? We good? Good? Okay, awesome. So managing and optimizing pressure and tension. So I came up with this topic just because there's a lot of things that I think are not necessarily understood or represented with the way that we look at some of these words that we throw around. So I wanted to kind of go into some of the definitions and the applications as to how some of these things influence the clients that we see, the patients that we treat, the programming we put together, how the body moves, how the body adapts, how the body compensates, and hopefully give you a different way of looking at things, as I mentioned before, from the inside out, that might allow you to have other programming ideas that, again, filled in with some of the mentorship things you'll be learning with the rest of Alex's program, will help with that whole process. So things we're going to cover, there's a bunch of different stuff here. I'm not going to read it all out because we're going to go through each of these, but I try to go through things from a sequential perspective, kind of lay some groundwork on some definitions of some things that we know from a verbiage and definition perspective from kind of being in the community, but also ways that you can actually think about applying it differently from what we've learned over the years. And then we'll go a little bit deeper into kind of human structure and function with, tubes, canisters, and vessels, and, pumps, gases, and fluids, and, all these other things that I have listed through here that will hopefully aid in when we get towards assessing and interventions, allow you to be able to have a better background and understanding as to some of the pictures and videos and things like that I'll demonstrate afterwards. Hang on a second here. So why pressure? So, pressure from a standpoint we think about as something negative. It's usually attributed to something negative. We think about it from the psychological aspect of things. We think about it from an element of the pressure that surrounds us, eternally, from the standpoint of day-to-day life, as well as the way that we apply principles of our lives to each other. But there's a lot of things related to pressure, especially with the way the human body functions, that is actually necessary and ideal. And it's the way that we're able to balance out the way that these pressures are influencing us physically, psychologically, cognitively, physiologically, that we want to try and create a better understanding of, so that when we go to kind of talk about these words and we talk about applications with day-to-day life, that we have a better understanding that there's elements of what we need related to pressure that is really necessary for us to balance out most effectively, for us to have the most ideal outcomes. So from a definition perspective, I broke it down into mechanical, and as well as a couple of other things, because you always got to have formulas, right? We always have to have these, the application of force in any direction onto something by something else in a direct contact with it. A little vague response, and it's looking at things very linearly with this model of, force being pushed down on top of a given area, with pressure being force divided by that area. And from a standpoint of how that applies to our own internal structures, if we have areas that are not ideally balanced to produce force against a surface area or against an internal or external surface area, then the body has to figure out another strategy to be able to create the opportunity to be able to create that force from somewhere else. I had a conversation with a client yesterday. We were talking about paddleboarding and talking about how, with regards to a paddle, the smaller the paddle, the more force you're going to get out of it, which seems kind of counterintuitive. But a bigger paddle is going to disperse more area, like this model demonstrates. So you're going to decrease the amount of force you have against it. It's like grabbing a barbell that's like this versus a barbell that's like that. That pressure you're able to exert is going to be different based upon the area with which the force is going to be able to be applied. And it's the action of that force against an opposing force. So if you think about sled pushes, or if you think about tire throws, things like that, it's not necessarily just this linear downward motion of pressure and force production we're looking at, but there's also angles, and it's how it's being put against that opposing force, which many times we're talking about is from a gravity perspective, pushing into a step or pushing into the ground, but it also has to do with cables, bands, barbells, things that are going to create a different element of that area that we're pushing against. But we also have to have strategies in place that allow us to be able to create the proper force production we need to be able to go against that either solid or mobile area that we're pushing against. It's the force or thrust that's exerted over a surface divided by its area, much like this thing talks about, and much like I talked about with that paddle. If you were to think about grabbing a sandbag of different sizes and grasping it and trying to create a throwing element to it, the size of that bag that you were to grab dictates how much force you're going to be able to put and where you have to navigate or manipulate your structure to be able to create the optimal output that you're looking for, given based upon the size of that, again, area or structure that you're pushing against. When it comes to some other definitions, from a societal perspective, this is the one that we often think about. It's the need to get things done. It's that pressure of a boss or a timeline, or something related to something hanging over our head, and an email or something we didn't get to. But that force or influence that cannot be avoided, that strain and stress response that it puts onto our cognitive system, that in my mind creates a significant influence on how our body then is able to perform and move based upon this internal stressors that our brain and our body have gone through. And how what we want to try to do is create elements of introducing strategies that allow us to be able to better manage how those things are influencing us psychologically, cognitively, behaviorally, so that we can then be able to create the optimal output that we're looking for in terms of like movement and movement expression. And from an atmospheric perspective, it's the weight of the air in the Earth's atmosphere, which we're familiar with. I mean, there's different atmospheric pressures based upon where we are in relationship to sea level. It's barometric, the changes in the barometric pressure based upon the weather changes. But it also has to do with the way that our pressure of our negative pressure, with the air that we take in, which is how we take air in, is via the atmospheric pressure and the balance of our levels to internally to match those external outside levels to be able to optimize our respiratory cycle. And from a medical perspective, we got a whole bunch. We got a list. This isn't even comprehensive, but we have a full list of all these different things that are medical. Arterial pressure, blood pressure, capillaries, cerebrospinal fluid, and on and on and on. And we'll talk about a few of these in particular. But when we think about these different pressures that our system is constantly trying to navigate throughout our daytime, whether it's this woman sleeping with a CPAP machine on, continuous positive airway pressure, to someone upright throwing something around or being performing at the highest level, all of these things have to have some degree of balance of these pressures for us to be able to create the optimal output that we're looking for. And there are times we want to jack some of those pressures up on purpose in order to create a performance outcome. And there's a lot of times we want to take them and down-regulate them and have them not be so influential in how the way our body is perceiving and or responding to the given environment that we're in. So then from a standpoint of tension, what are we looking at? So tension is, we usually use those interchangeably. It's not uncommon, but there's some pretty distinct differences in many situations, physically as well as medically, which we'll talk about. But from a standpoint of this tension, what this picture demonstrates is those opposing forces pulling away from each other. So much like this picture shows, where you've got these children in a tug of war against a static object, and their happy little faces as they're kind of tugging back and forth. That's the tension that we're talking about from a mechanical perspective. It's the condition of being held in a state between two or more forces, which are acting in opposition to each other. And it can be awesome and humorous and fun, like this picture demonstrates, or it can be just the opposite in many other situations. It's a type of force that tries to stretch or pull apart a material. Think about it though, we have a rope here, and you have these two opposing forces. So you're gonna have the opposing forces creating this tensile mechanism taking place, versus if you have a resistance band or something that has a little bit of give, where now you're gonna have different levels of tension based upon the degree of output and force being produced, but also the way that the body is positioned based upon the direction of pull that's being done. From a societal standpoint, we've got hostility between two or more individuals or groups, kind of like we talked about societal with pressure. Pretty evident in today's world about where we're at with that. So without going too much into that, there's that tension that develops and how that creates from an atmospheric perspective. We've all kind of heard the phrase of, the tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. It's taking a concept and an idea and putting it into a palpable sense that some people feel. That's the powerful nature with which we use some of these words and the influence that it has on us. That tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife reflects that there's these two opposing forces that are there. And I'll use the word energy. The energy that creates in that room can be felt and palpated just as easily as that tension and energy can be felt between that tug of war between those children. And then from a medical perspective, we've got the partial pressure of a component of a gas mixture dissolved in a fluid, such as oxygen and blood. And that's partial pressure tension. And that's the gas mixture element in blood. And there's a number of other ones that we could go into, but just to remember how these words are being used in so many different environments in different ways, but to try to keep in check the fact that they all represent something just a little bit different, but all based upon the same base definition. We've got mental, emotional, or nervous strain, okay? Tension headaches. If you think about a tension headache, it's kind of like that sense of pulling apart. It creates that element of pressure that's just too much. I'm being torn in different directions, the tension that produces. We've got tissue tension or equilibrium, and we can call it a bunch of different things. Equilibrium, we can call it neutrality, we can call it balance, we can call it homeostasis. This tension that we're constantly trying to have our structures, our internal tissues navigate as effectively as possible. Again, for the higher level activities that we need to be able to create that increased level of tension so that we're able to maintain that constant push and pull that doesn't allow us to be able to create any energy leaks or any opportunities to lose that capacity. versus the more down regulation aspect of that tissue tension for recovery, for sleep, for down regulation of the system, and therefore the rest of the body. And then like this picture depicts, there's length tension relationship as well too, in terms of like sarcomeres, contractile qualities within muscles, force output, and the active force versus the passive forces, and how that changes sarcomere length and tension relationship. And so we're going to spend some time today talking about is kind of combining them. And what ways can we use these different elements to our advantage in a number of different situations to try and optimize the balance between these pressures and tensions. One way you could combine it is actually just take the words and call it prension, and the other way is you can call it tensure. But we'll talk about it a little differently than just the simplistic version of that. So here's a balloon, and I want to talk a little about wall tension, okay? So there's a lot of verbiage in this little picture here, but what this demonstrates is a balloon that's blown up, and they obviously deliberately didn't blow it all the way just to teach Pascal's principle. So at equilibrium, the pressure inside a vessel, gas, or liquid mechanics is the same. So the pressure throughout the internal mechanism of that balloon is the same at the tip as it is inside. Now, what happens is that the wall tension element is what happens along that outer surface. So in the middle of that balloon where it's blown up the most, the change in pressure in one part is transmitted without loss to every portion of the fluid and to the walls of the container. This is the stiffest, highest wall tension. It's expanding, and it's got to create more tension as it's being pulled apart to sustain that pressure that's engaged internally. There's very little wall tension that's happening at that tip. It's more flaccid. You can kind of picture what that balloon end would feel like. It would be more flaccid. Recognizing as well too that there's still this balance internally of the way that all of these gas molecules are balanced inside, and that how this applies with respect to fluid is something like this demonstration of this picture shows. So using fluid as a hydraulic press, okay, for lifting cars. As you can see, this container that's on both sides has the ability to create the necessary wall tension to maintain the fluid inside, so that when that original force on the left is being pushed down, due to the equilibrium of the pressure inside that vessel, as that's pushing down and that fluid is being exerted towards that opposite side, it's able to produce enough force through the fluid to lift that vehicle. That's an element of what I want to have you think about, even though I'm not talking about lifting cars, although strongman competitions they are. But to that point, there's elements of what we're trying to do internally that's to create the balance of that, to be able to have the body be able to create this, this external wall tension stability across different areas of the body to navigate the task at hand while not losing it to any type of imbalance. Again, I keep calling it energy leaks, which I'll refer to a little bit later on, and why I talk about it that way, because that's where that loss of that stability, if we want to call it that, or the loss of the container in one place becomes compromised. And that's where people begin to kind of lose force output, or even worse, make themselves more vulnerable to injury. And then gases always move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So, I used the analogy before, like, if you think about a party, you got a room of people and it's packed, and you got a room of people where it's not so packed. After a period of time, they kind of have a tendency to all kind of disperse. And that's kind of no different than the way that gas and molecules are inside as well too. If it's areas that have a lot of stuff bouncing around and is really dense, it's going to have this tendency to want to kind of balance thing out. And what we're trying to do with the human structure we have is figure out those areas that have too much concentration, too much pressure, too much wall tension on one side, and not enough to offset it on the opposite side or in a different direction, and try to create some balance and equilibrium there. So now Laplace's law talks about wall tension in relationship to the size of the canister itself, okay? So the larger the vessel radius, the larger the wall tension required to withstand a given internal fluid pressure. The pressure and radius are used to measure the wall tension. And what this is demonstrating is, with a set amount of pressure being exerted against the whole wall of that cylinder, that tension has to be balanced to be able to create optimal containers. If I have one that creates a smaller container where I have the same amount of wall tension on the outside, I'm going to have a tendency to have the more pressure internally on this smaller container than I am on the larger container, given the same amount of wall tension. Now, I want to bring that to reality and why I'm here to talk about it, let's talk about bodies, all right? So two very different structures, okay? And these are just a couple of clients. So can you see with the client on the left, if you talk about wall tension and how, hopefully you can kind of see my mouse, that the wall tension on the back side of him here is going to be different than the wall tension on the front side of him here. So we can call this lengthened, we can call this distended, we can call this lordotic, we can call this concentric, we can call this each, we can call a lot of different things. But what I want to create in your head is that our internal stuff in that container is not being ideally contained in this person. So he's going to have more distension anteriorly because of the increased wall tension on the backside. It's a mismatch of the grabbing of his body. This structure on the right, as you can tell, is much different shaped. And now she has a smaller radius, right? And so with this person, as you can tell, with that smaller radius, she's going to have more internal pressure. She has less capability of expansive abilities to be able to open things up. He's got too much here, not enough here. She's got not enough expansive capabilities, in my mind, in many different directions. And from a standpoint of kind of looking at body archetypes and the influence that they have on behaviors and the way that they present, not only physically and physiologically, but also psychologically and emotionally, these archetypes have a tendency, because of that increased pressure, to feel like their brain and their bodies are under a lot of pressure. And I think a lot of you who work with clients in the industry for quite some time know what I'm talking about. Those overtoned, overcompressed people that come to us are the ones that are really seem a little bit more overall in angst. Not all of them, but I want to create that element that I talked about before of the physical pressurized system and the influence that has on the cognitive pressurized state. Yeah, I go deep. I go deep for those of you that don't know me. Okay, so now we've got surface tension. So the reason surface tension matters is because we've got a lot of it in our body and it's super important. So what is surface tension? It's a resistance that acts to preserve the integrity of a surface. So, this picture here on the left, as you can tell, the liquid is showing the distribution and tensile elements being pushed in all different directions, okay? Those are molecules of water and pushing out in different directions. And once it gets to the surface here, how that suddenly creates an element of tension this way, remembering the word tension being pulling apart. So this creates a fluid that we can move through underneath the surface, but at the surface area, that's now created a little bit of a barrier. It's kind of like a buoyancy element. And you can see the water skippers on the right know how to utilize that. Sure, they're super light, but they know how to disperse their body in a way that they can use that surface tension to be able to move all over. Well, the interesting thing about surface tension of a liquid is that where the liquid is in contact with the gas, it acts as a thin elastic sheet, but it's also dependent upon temperature. And so when the temperature of the liquid changes and or the outside atmosphere changes, that will change the surface tension capabilities. The colder the water, the stiffer the fluid. The hotter the water, the more liquid it is. If you think about your body moving on, going outside in cold temperatures, or when you're cool, things don't slide and glide quite as easily. Or versus where those gases are a little bit warmer, sure, blood flow, permeation, all that kind of stuff matters, but there's elements of that, the viscosity and that surface tension movement capabilities that changes in that warmer environment because that surface tension isn't quite so taut on that area. And we'll talk about how that applies to parts of the body in just a little bit. Visualize the internal pressure, which tends to be pushing things apart, is counteracted by the surface tension acting around the perimeter. So, I used wall tension before as an element. You can picture that wall tension and surface tension being comparable, one just being more liquid based. If you think about the structures that surround our organs internally, if you think about the construct of fascial structures and the water content, if you think about the pleura that surrounds parts of our body, which I'll talk about in just a little bit, and how important this surface tension is that we maintain as balanced as we can all around, so that the body can then adapt to utilize it as good as is possible in many different directions as is possible. So a good example of this is this swimmer. So cool picture, but you can see the glaze of the water where he has taken that water and is utilizing it to slide up underneath. As you know, if you ever watch swimming, they're not moving much when they're like this. But they're at this level in particular, they're using that water surface tension to glide underneath to be able to create flow and fluid movement as smoothly as possible, because they know that as soon as they break that surface tension or the surface of the water, now they have to create force to be able to move through the water most effectively. We'll use it to slide and glide as much as we possibly can. Thinking about kind of like a slide board or something like that. That's what you're looking for, is that ability to create this fluid sliding element that wants to take place so that things can move independent of each other. I've used the analogy before, like if you have a bowl and you put a piece of raw chicken in there and you try to move it around, it kind of sticks and it just doesn't move well. And so if you've got poor surface tension and poor fluid balance around structures, that's what it's like inside. It's just stiff and tight. But put a little oil in there and you can move and manipulate that raw chicken as much as you possibly can. And that's what I'm trying to create a picture of in people's heads, is we want this balance of the way that we can create this surface tension capabilities through some of the tools and strategies, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So another really great pictorial example of surface tension is literally where, like, this shark is bending the water. Like, it's a super cool picture. There's an element of electromagnetic chemical balance, what happens with the surface of the water and the shark and things like that. But that bending of the water, they're utilizing that surface tension right to the point where then they break through the water. And that's an element of what I think is super important for people to recognize as to what happens to us internally if we're able to manipulate it optimally. Plus, it's a super cool picture. Okay, so now we have interface or interfacial tension. So this is the surface of a liquid where the liquid is in contact with another liquid. And so what this picture demonstrates is, it's kind of like, someone split down the middle. We're looking at it from the inside. You got the lungs on each side. You got the hilum of the lung, which is showing basically where, that's also called the root of the lungs, where the aorta and vena cava kind of go in and out and allow the dispersion of fluid exchange for O2, CO2. But what I want to show you this picture of is that bright blue and how it's showing these two layers of pleura, fluid. We've got the parietal pleura and we got the visceral pleura. We got two opportunities for structures to lubricate and allow those lungs to move and slide and glide. And we've got another outer casing that allows the rib cage to move around it. And the picture I want to have people create in their heads is, and I tell my clients this, I literally want to have your body learn to move your outsides around your insides. And we create the opportunity to do that by taking some of those examples of those two clients that I showed you before and balance out. One of them on the right's expansive capabilities for the fluid flow, and the one on the left's capabilities to create more expansive capabilities and compressive capabilities to allow the fluid flow to be more even, to have the system be able to then respond more positively for movement opportunities. Hang on a sec here, sorry. It leads to a close apposition of organ and tissue surfaces, which also allows for transmission of movement. So to appose something means to juxtapose against, okay? So like if I have, as it shows here in this picture, the diaphragm's ability to kind of come up and maintain that apposition with the lungs and that apposition with the rib cage to create suction capabilities with the fluids that are in there, to be able to then say, okay, so as that diaphragm is pumping and moving, I'm able to kind of pump and move the lungs, and I'm able to kind of pump and move the rib cage so that it can do its job of respiratory action. At the same time, it's using that gas and fluid movement inside to then say, this suction's gonna help me. This suction's gonna help me be able to then manipulate my body and move it from the inside out, even though it's more my outside musculature that's actually doing the dynamic movement. And that's what some of the strategies, which we'll talk about in a little bit, are designed to try to represent. I tell people thinking about a vacuum effect. So if you take a step and you step in mud and how that kind of grabs your foot and kind of suctions you down, and then you have to kind of break that barrier in order to kind of get it out. I don't want people breaking the barrier internally. I want to keep that suction. And little things like keeping the tongue on the roof of the mouth and learning to breathe through the nose and being able to kind of keep that compact canister in a good shape so that that structure is as balanced as possible for the task at hand, keeps that suction capabilities from it, keeps it in valid and in check. keeps it functioning well. It actually will feel harder to maintain that and do the things that we want to have our clients do. But that's why it's so valuable, because we want this internal suctioning to allow our system to be able to then function ideally in opposition to each other, so that if one is moving in one direction, it's not necessarily being tugged with it. They're all able to move independent of one another. So apposition means keeping things in contact to work well. Opposition means we need them to also be able to move individually from each other. Dissociation, so that we're not having this whole structure move as one unit and potentially create problems with tugging on structures that we don't want to have tugged on. So what does all that mean? So the goal is to manage and balance out internal pressures, front to back, top to bottom, side to side, in order to optimize the use of internal tensional properties for movement, force production, and recovery. So I put this on here to show the different ways that our body can develop these imbalanced pressures. Front to back, top to bottom, side to side. I say that with my clients all the time. I'm just trying to get all these layers that are a little imbalanced into a little better state of balance. I didn't say symmetry, I said balance. And from a tensional properties perspective, that allows not only movement and optimal, ideal, incredible force production, but it also aids in recovery because the system feels safe, because it's kept those things well contained. That suctioning is keeping us pumping and keeping things in a good position. So then I can manipulate it from breathing heavy to then, so like, I can quickly get my system to settle down. I can move freer and easier so that I get to that recovered state that much faster and easier. It allows my digestion to occur that much easier. All my fluids are flowing much better. So all that stuff can settle down and chill after a hard session or a hard competition. So they're really used for all elements from the highest level to the lowest level. So that brings us to kind of fluids, and you know, I think about fluids very differently than I used to over the years, which is ideal. You know, if you read different things related to fluids, some things will say we're made of 75% water. I mean, they throw numbers around that are kind of rough, and I put this up here just to represent the different representation of fluid content that can be absorbed. I'm sorry, that can be recognized as part of these structures. But from everything that I've read and from different research and things like that and my understanding of the body, we're actually mostly water. And if you think about how we started on the cellular level, that's pretty much all fluid. So our cells literally go through decision-making processes during the embryonic development about what they're going to take on in terms of structures. Some of them take on bony structures, some of them take on organ structures, some take on brain tissue. And it's part of that development that is so beautiful and awesome. But it brings it back down to the most basic of fluid levels. Pretty much everything we think about with our body movement comes down to tissue movement, flow, all these other great things, but everything bends and moves in our body. Everything torques and twists in our body, including bones. If our bones don't have the capability of being a lot of fluid, a lot of capability of being able to bend, then we'll be breaking bones and snapping way more than we do. The analogy I like to tell people is if you take a branch and you snap it off a tree and you go to bend it, it bends. But if that same branch fell off the tree and you grab it, a couple months later, it snaps. We think about anatomy as being bones being brittle because that's the person we see on the cadaver table or the skeleton representations we have in our facilities. But the reality is this bending is really super important, and it's really beneficial for our ability to create this pressurized tensile elements we need to create the desired task at hand. I had a client earlier today who's, I didn't use these words with her, but her sacrum is bent. She has the sacrum that's been torqued and pulled and yanked so much that it's in this really torqued position like this. And look at the x-ray, you can kind of see it. Now, what's happening? She's got muscles pulling. She's got areas that are over pressurized. She's got body that couldn't be able to contain and manage it into a good position. There's reasons other than just that happened, but keep in mind when thinking about things moving and someone planning and changing direction, and the tug of those muscles and tendons on those bones have to allow some of that twist to take place for them to not be able to actually break down and cause bigger problems. So what kind of fluids are we talking about here? Okay, so we've got these 5 on the right. These are, a big portion of what we're kind of made of in terms of fluids: water, blood, sweat, and tears. I put them together for a reason. Those of us who are old know the band. Synovial, CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, heart and lung fluids. We got this other stuff. I alphabetized it because they're all kind of, if you say any of them, they're just kind of like, gross, but they're all essential. And they're all part of the fluids that our body is constantly trying to navigate throughout the daytime and put into place and be able to kind of say, if I go to plant and change direction, I don't want any of this stuff going too much in one way. I don't want to have someone's cerebral spinal fluid get so stiff because things are so compressed and twisted that it can't flow well, that's affecting their nervous system and creating nerve symptoms or creating some type of nervous response as a result of it. And that's what these ideas that we're talking about today are designed to do, is to create a balance of all these things so we can contain them as ideally as possible. So people who have heard me lecture, and as you guys know from Alex and anything like that, breathing's a big thing. I was talking to someone this morning, and for 20, whatever, a whole bunch of time now, I've been on this breathing study because I've just recognized the importance of it and how we function. And I was always the odd guy out, which is fine. I was fine with it, but I'm incredibly validated now by how much everybody's recognizing it and wanting to learn more about it and how to utilize it to manipulate how the body functions ideally. When I say the word breathing over the course of this talk, and anytime I use it with my clients, I'm talking about it on a number of different levels. But the level from particular I want to utilize it today is a tool. And it's the most powerful volitional tool in the toolbox that I have for a client to use to be able to create the changes that I was talking about before. To be able to take muscles and tendons, fluids and structures inside and create areas that have been overpressurized and shortened and get them to open up, and get areas that have been overexpanded and or too eccentric in length and not under good control, and create compression, concentric activity, and then be able to then create a change at what we create for a load for these people. And sometimes manipulating breath as a result of it to then reinforce it, to be most successful with your outcomes for what you're trying to deal with. In particular for people who you see during your assessments have a fair amount of imbalances or a fair amount of things like I demonstrated in those other pictures. It is pumping fluids all day long. Remember, I talked about the fluid pump and how lifting vehicles and the balance of the fluids as much as possible, you can create force output that can lift a car. Well, that diaphragm is doing the same thing. It's doing it on guts, it's doing it with lungs, but it's doing it with all the fluids that I alluded to in the pictures before, in terms of that pleural fluid, in terms of the internal fluids in our viscera, in our fascial structures, and that creating that internal suctioning pump mechanism that allows us to maintain control of that, optimizes the external muscle position and joint position that we can then use to be able to create optimal training and create optimal performance. So we'll talk about tubes, canisters, and vessels, okay? Anatomy is good, so I'm going to talk, you'll see some anatomy pictures here just because I think it helps to kind of represent things pretty well for people. I think sometimes we don't look at that quite enough. In particular, I think that some of the things that are represented in drawings are very inaccurate, and it's a way to try and create ease of understanding of people who are looking at it. Not all muscles are red, not all tendons are white, our nerves aren't yellow, but we've got to kind of delineate them in a way that we can kind of create understanding for representation. But the things that I'll show you in terms of pictures here is to create a better idea about how complicated it is. And this picture right here on the left, demonstrating demonstrating the trachea as it comes down. And as you can see, the representation of the collarbones and those top ribs. And that's that kind of very fade picture of the manubrium and the sternum on the front, how that goes down and then splits into both sides to go into the lungs. And what you can see right away as that splits, that a couple of things are pretty evident. Number one, when it goes to one side and it goes to the other side, it's not at the same angle. Number two, as those bronchioles start to kind of branch out a little bit, they're not branching out symmetrically. And how this whole change that happens and chain of events that happens through that whole lung is not the same on both sides for a reason. It's a little bit different in each person, but this complex network of tubes and vessels that are being branching out inside the lungs is super important. And I'll show you a picture in just a little bit. It's super important to keep in mind because these things are not just hollow balloons inflating with air. It's all of these things that have to be able to expand. All of these bronchioles, all the way out to the very, very tips. We're trying to create as much ideal expansive and compressive capabilities as possible to keep that tensile properties in place. This cross section up here is also important to see as well too, because you can see it represents the trachea and the esophagus that are incredibly different shaped. And you can see how one's stacked run right on top of the other. And how if you've got someone who has a position, let's just talk about someone who's a sway back with a forward head, can you see the direction that that trachea has to go to be able to get down, and how that's going to bend and have to twist for air to move or for digestion to occur? Or if you've got someone who's just very imbalanced, how that could create torque as that trachea goes down and descends down and towards those lungs, above and beyond what happens to the physical structure that we can see in terms of like rib cages. But all that stuff will affect the way that food is passed, the way that air is flowed, and all those other elements. But our goal is to try and keep these things as balanced as possible so that they can constantly be pumping and inflating and deflating as evenly as possible. Oops. So there's a good picture here. I just wanted to kind of show how it branches out in the network. So again, here's that picture of how the hilum or the root of the lungs on each side, how that complex network with the heart happens, how that blood flow through that area allows the body to be able to kind of pick up the O2 and the CO2, disperse it through the body, dump out the CO2 during exhalation to allow that to occur. But this picture on the far right, where it kind of blows down into that whole capillary network, is super important to recognize because those alveoli rely on surface tension. If they don't have surface tension at the end, then the surfactant, which is necessary for that dispersion, that perfusion of the fluids of the O2 and the CO2, becomes compromised. And sure, it can lead to lung diseases and stuff like that, but it's happening on a regular basis with a lot of the clients you see because of some of those imbalances that we talked about. And that decreased capability of those areas that I was alluding to with those tubes before to be able to expand in all directions, to have that O2 and CO2 go kind of as many different directions as possible for optimal excursion, to have that pick that up and be pulled through the blood will affect all types of things from a not only a medical perspective, but also just a general health perspective. So this I put in here because it's a good kind of representation of, they ain't hollow, folks. You know, those bronchioles, they go all out and they branch and branch and branch and branch and branch. And, you know, I allude to people kind of like, you know, the lungs are kind of like crock pots, you know, you kind of dump something in there, they kind of mix it up, they shake things out, you put it back out, and it puts out something that's very different. You know, your O2, CO2 levels are very different upon exhalation than they are on inhalation. Nitrogen's the same, but different topic. So I want you to kind of picture in your head that this is the areas that we're trying to get the body to be able to optimally balance out as much as possible. So let's talk about it now from a canister perspective. You know, the word core is used a lot, and I'm fine with people using the word core, just because I think it creates a picture and a representation that people can appreciate. And you know, if I asked people what they thought kind of the core was, you know, many people would probably allude to, you know, the diaphragm and the pelvic floor, transverse abdominis and abdominal wall in the front, spine on the back. But you know, there really is no core. You know, from a standpoint of what you're looking at, they're all integrated. And if anything, it's kind of like, you know, the very tops of the shoulders, you know, all of this stuff, this network here works with the core all the way down to the bottom of that pelvic floor towards the tops of the legs. I mean, it really is kind of all one unit. And so when we talk about, core stabilization and core strengthening, we can use that verbiage to say, yeah, I want that canister to change its shape. I want to get things to a position where I create the stuff that's a little bit too open, close it off a little bit. Stuff that's too closed off, get it to open up a little bit. And then, oh yeah, by the way, teach it to not be too stiff and too still so that it can have some movement that goes through it as it goes and moves from one side to the other or whatever the task is we're trying to do. And how this picture on the right here, which is representative, kind of like the DNS, the Dynamic Neuromuscular Stabilization School of Thought, I'm pretty sure it's from the website, you know, demonstrates that intra-abdominal and intra-pelvic pressure we're trying to optimize. You know, I work on optimizing intrathoracic pressure first with people, but I'm doing it in conjunction with intra-abdominal and intra-pelvic pressure at the same time. As I mentioned, canister, I use the egg-shaped model with people pretty regularly. And I want you picturing this kind of this oval shape, being able to do this as much as possible, as often as possible in all directions. This is what this picture is demonstrating. And how those little blue arrows on the right are saying, yeah, by the way, it's supposed to push back. So as that pressure is being exerted in, there's also a pressure that's supposed to be able to go back to be able to help to create some control of the structures internally from the inside. So I put this on here too because it's just good to kind of recognize the areas of the thorax, kind of undelineated, but they're kind of regional areas of the body that are gaps where spaces can occur, where things can kind of have to be filled with stuff that we've got inside. So we've got this anterior mediastinum, which is kind of like the front of the chest wall, kind of right up underneath that sternum. That is that blue portion right there. That's what it represents. And how if you've got like the picture of the woman on the right that I talked about, that's a very depressed sternum, very depressed rib cage on that front. How that anterior mediastinum, that's not going to get expansion. So that's going to have to try to figure out a way to figure out how to do something different. When we talk about pump handle mechanics in just a little bit, that'll make more sense. We've got the posterior mediastinum, which is in green. That's the dorsal, the back side of that back. So that area right there too, as you can see with that green down below here, space. And that diaphragm that you see domed in that position right up underneath the heart there, we want to keep that domed in that position as much as possible, because if that changes its orientation and position in any way, or contractile elements, then it's going to create spaces. And those spaces create loss of suction. And that loss of suction creates energy leaks, which means that that has to be able to be dispersed into a different direction. Hope that's kind of clarifying things a little bit. We got the superior mediastinal region too, right here. You can see that line right at the top of the aorta, right where it kind of exits the heart, excuse me, and where that bisection is right between kind of thoracic spine 4 and 5. You know, that demonstrates as well too, right at that sternomanubrial joint. So it's right at that element that I talked about before, that's right there. So if I don't have that all being able to do this evenly, that's going to affect sternum, manubrium, thoracic spine, as well as the ribs that we know and recognize that are supposed to open and close. And I put this cross section in here too, because I think it's good to kind of look down at stuff, and it does talk about those pleural spaces again and demonstrates those pretty well. So this is someone lying on their back with their feet to you. So you got the right lung on the left-hand side and the left on the right, which sounds counterintuitive, but that's what it is. So, so what I wanted to kind of put this on here for is, again, I want to kind of show the way that those pleural bodies wrap around, how those lungs wrap around. The left lung in particular actually wraps all the way around at certain aspects of it. It goes down a little bit further, and how we want to envelop this around that rib cage. So we create this suctioning capability of that pleura all around. So that creates that optimal control of that rib cage and spine to create the suctioning on the sides, much like I talked about the suctioning down below that we're trying to create, that allows that expansion and compression capabilities of the diaphragm to take place. So with regards to pumps, gases, and fluids, you know, again, this is a good example. I talked about anatomy pictures and kind of getting an idea. It's very simplistic. You know, it's kind of basically showing a diaphragm that's, you know, like this, and that's not the way that the diaphragm is. But just for teaching purposes, it helps to kind of create a good idea in your head. While breathing in, that involuntary mechanism, resting tidal breathing, what you're doing right now, okay? You're not thinking about it, is diaphragm contraction, expanding the ribs, negative pressure, pulling air into those lungs, hopefully dispersed as evenly as possible. Increase in volume means lower pressure. So meaning more filled, you're going to have less of that wall tension, like I talked about before, capturing that capability. It's going to change because now as it gets bigger, we need that wall tension to be able to adjust to that change in shape during inhalation. We need it to maintain control. I don't want to have it let go, which it happens for a lot of people. Let's say like this, distension. Let's say like this, sway back, where that loss of wall tension around that whole area has compromised the ability to maintain that balanced pressure, even though it's lower pressure internally. And the body will then try to seek that equilibrium that I talked about with gases internally, even though this shape change has occurred. It's like, hey, you've created this shape change. So now I'm going to bounce off my gases inside as a result of that. So then it's going to keep following that path pretty consistently. Breathing out, decrease in volume means higher pressure. That's the woman on the right that I talked about. In that compressed state, higher pressure system, again, that wall tension is going to become even harder because now it is going to change a little bit. Like I talked about, if the wall tension were the same on on two different size vessels, then you're going to have more pressure. You're constantly changing the wall tension of the structure externally is what we're trying to do, but not lose it as we get into this larger radius during inhalation, where it doesn't let go. Maintain that consistent amount throughout the whole time. We're trying to constantly balance this out, both concentrically and eccentrically. And Alex will do a great job of talking about that with regards to some of the things related to, what's becoming concentric and what's becoming eccentric. But, easiest way to phrase it is, I want some balance of each of that. In my mind, pretty much everything's on gradients. You're going to have some contractile and some expansive element taking place all the time. You're going to have some eccentric, it's just, it is what it is. When you're inhaling, you're not just inhaling, there's exhalation elements taking place at the same time and vice versa. So recognize that there's this constant flow. And I often use the analogy of tides or waves to recognize that it's this constant ebb and flow that takes place. And the reason I use tides as an element is because sometimes it's a little more brackish water. Other times it's a little more clear. Do you know what I mean? That salination change is reflective of the way that our chemical change occurs inside us. And we want that to be constantly going this way and not constantly pushing ourselves in one direction or the other. The force of pressure against walls also affected by flow and friction, both with air going in and air going out. So what the heck do I mean by that? So if I look at this, the syringe and the size of that syringe, and as I push on that syringe, that fluid is being compressed, right? It's being compressed evenly against the walls of that syringe. And as that outlet gets smaller, we're going to have even more pressure because, again, the size of the cylinder has changed, okay? Think about it from a standpoint of how we utilize breath. So if I have this mechanism take place, it's going to be a very different pressure distribution than if I do type of an exhalation. One is going to create more pressure against wall tension, against the walls of that structure, versus another one that's lost some of that internal pressure mechanism capabilities to utilize as a tool. It's not wrong, and there's an indication for both of those. But remembering what it means in terms of like the walls is not just what's being exerted through here or the glottis, but it's what's happening against the trachea. It's what's happening against the bronchioles. It's what's happening against the pleural sacs, and on and on and on. And how there's also the force of pressure against walls is affected by the flow and friction. So, the force output, like I alluded to with the breath, is similar to like a garden hose. And if you got, you turn the water on with a garden hose and it's an open end, the water just kind of comes out like this as an easy, gentle stream. But if I want to kind of water the back of the garden, I put my thumb over the end, and as I kind of close that off more, water goes out more because the pressure internally against the walls of the hose has increased. Keep that in mind when thinking about force production. I want to create that pressure against the walls of the hose, the canister, to allow that to be utilized as a tool for force production. So I put this in here because I think it does a nice job of kind of representing kind of what happens from suction. So as I play this, what I want you to kind of see is when the inhales, diaphragm going down, exhale, diaphragm going up. Inhale, diaphragm going down, exhale, diaphragm going up. Suctioning, pulling down, elongating even, watch the heart, even the heart as it gets pulled. Oops, sorry about that. Let me start that over again. This is me with my camera in my laptop, so. So suctioning, inhalation, expanding the lungs, pulling them down. Everything gets pulled down and lengthened, okay? You have your people who are, we joke about them called long, tall Sallys. People, lungs will stretch like this. Just as we talk about them being expanded in other directions, they can get pulled down because they're elastic. And I want to create people, tell people, some of them, like, I want to walk around you all day long and just press on your shoulders. I want to make you squatty. I want to compress you from the top because your body doesn't know how to do that. They're the ones that have difficulty with grounding, which I'm sure which I'm sure you'll learn with some of Alex's lectures. Okay. So there's this as well too. So this is a nice representation of the bucket handle, okay? So during inhalation, I talked about suction, diaphragm going down, creating expansion of the lungs. We want this, where my mouse you go, there we go. We want bucket handles. We want the sides of the ribs to be able to go up enough. We want the sternum to be able to go up enough, not up. Pump handle. Oh, wait a minute. Pump handle's doing what? It's pumping fluid. Via what? Suction. Via what? Pressure. Picture that in your head. If you can kind of keep running that through your head periodically as you're kind of playing with some of your own model, some of your own exercises and activities, I think it'll help. Really cool picture, beautiful drawing. A little more accurate because it does represent a little bit more like what the diaphragm really is like in terms of the right and the left being a little bit different. Beautiful, awesome, we need it that way. And how when it contracts and pulls down, where it's pulling more from the pleura, or the crust of where the back of that diaphragm is attached to the spine, that's allowing that descent, as I talked about, of the diaphragm, where the lungs open up, things get pulled down, expansion can occur. And again, then this contractile element of the muscles being able to then create this compressive element. During resting tidal breathing, again, some of you already know all this stuff, but during resting tidal breathing, exhalation's passive. But I'm often utilizing a more active exhalation strategy with clients early on to get them to be able to create the change in that canister shape, to bring it all, to rein it all into a better starting position, so that now I've created more suction capabilities. I've been able to create apposition of all the structures and organs to create that capacity of them to be in this position. Pause, allow things to settle into place, suction can occur, and then during that next inhalation, we can then, depending upon the position we have them in, allow the body to be able to then change its expansive capabilities into different directions. And again, some of the things that you'll learn through this mentorship will be great to have you recognize the positions you can put people in that can create a marked change right away. And I put this on here just because it's good to have people recognize the layers of musculature that are all working together during even passive exhalation, but in particular during active exhalation. I mentioned abs to my clients just because it's easiest to have them understand, but I want intercostals. I want intercostals in the right position and this right cross-networking capability to be able to inhale with the externals and exhale with the internals, so that there's this fine line of this diagonal element, which this picture does a nice job representing, of allowing that rib cage to become an active participant. So when they go to rotate, to throw med balls, or to be able to kind of do push-pull activities, they've got intercostal capabilities that allow them to maintain that good diagonal balance for respiration while they're doing it. But guess what? They're also going to rotate too. And if they're in a mismatch of position because something's stretched or compressed, you're not going to be able to have that rotation occur where it's supposed to through the rib cage most effectively to become this dynamic organ. Then they start to begin to kind of rotate through spines or be able to rotate through necks and things like that, because it doesn't have that active neuro capability muscularly. So, a little phrase, I kind of use this often, respiration is much like life. It is continual management of various pressures and tension coming from both outside and from within, with some greater than others. Not all pressures are bad. The body is trying to find control and balance of them and position itself to best adapt to them. So from a summation aspect of what we just talked about, I think it's important to realize that I talked about the cognitive and behavioral piece of that, because that can't not be a factor in some of your clients. I came into work Tuesday, a little distracted, okay? I think a lot of people did, because of just internal stuff that's going on. And so as a result of that, you're gonna have clients who come in like that for various reasons. They just left work. They just left a disagreement with their spouse. You know what I mean? They were homeschooling their kids all day because of the environment that we're in right now. And now they're coming in a little lost. So this balance of pressures that are happening, not only physically, which we're talking about, which we can handle well, but also behaviorally and cognitively is super important. often when I'm lecturing, if I'm with a group and I'll say, okay, how many of you are behavioral therapists? And nobody raises their hand. I'm like, okay, everybody raise your hand. How many of you are behavioral therapists? Because every single client you're working with, you're doing behavior work because you're constantly trying to keep them up, have them understand, educate them, make them feel better, listening to their lives, because sometimes you're listening to stuff that they can't say at home because everybody's heard it or whatever. They don't want to talk about it there. So don't forget the behavioral part of things and relay and recognize ways that when you read your clients as they're coming in to talk to you for your session, that you might have some powerful inputs about ways you might want to tweak your program a little bit that way based upon how they're presenting to you. Sometimes it's physical, you can see how they are. Other times it's just how they're acting. Sorry about that soapbox, but a little side note that I think is important to recognize. All right, so pressure, tension, and torque. So I like these pictures a lot. It's from an osteopathic-based book, actually. And the reason I like it is because it shows how organs move, okay? Now, arrows are like drawings like this are always represented. That makes it look like your lungs are dislocating. So don't read too much into the size of the arrows or what they're doing. It's showing a general movement process that takes place. If left unchecked, those lungs during inhalation, left unchecked, those lungs will do exactly what those are showing. And they won't go back at all. And they won't keep this shape, this canister's ability to do this. And then it starts to do this. Because that spin that it's trying to do, that it's used to doing, does too much because it's left unchecked, because the canister lost its control. And how you got the heart spins on an axis. I mean, it's on a leftward axis. It developed that way. It's supposed to be that way. I won't go into kind of like precession of the earth and torque of the planets, but I mean, there's elements of this torque and precession that's not only inside us, but is prevalent in society. And it's important to realize that we spin everything in our body. When we breathe air in, it spins its way in. When fluids are moving through our body, they're spinning their way through the body. Why? Torque. Torque is what's going to keep those things spinning with control. It's when they start to pump too much that the body begins to lose some of that torsional capabilities and control of a structure, because now it's too loose. Now we've lost some of that container control that we want to try to manage the whole time. Yeah, even on the fluid level, I think. I put this in. It's a pretty cool video of something that, I mean, some of you are familiar with this from, Bill Hartman's information, who we all thank tremendously for lots of things. It's a nice representation of the spin of the heart. So I want to show you pump and look at that heart movement and how that spin that it produces and how it's spinning the fluids in and out and how that comes in, pushes it in, pushes it in, pushes it out. And that spin, pump, is important to keep in mind because that's happening in various parts of our body. Flows in right there, whoop, spins, spins. That opens it. Spins, spins, okay? Lovely, thank you. But you get the idea. Just that spinning element is how we are. And it's awesome and it's necessary, but we need to control it. And so these are, them spinning guts. So, this is kind of demonstrating kind of what's happening with the kidneys and the movement down and outward that happens. A little more in one direction than the other for many people. And that pancreas, look at that thing. It's like, whoo, I'm heading out to lunch. So again, demonstration of a little bit of an exaggeration with the arrows, but just kind of keeping in mind that there's this thing that's happening inside us all the time that's constantly pulling on structures. I mean, look at this. Look at us inside. We're a mess. So this is the mesentery. So that mesentery attaches at an angle. It attaches from lumbar spine on one side to sacrum on the other side. And that angle is 6 inches in length and thick and dense. And the other end of it's 6 meters. So that thing flapping and being pulled is tugging and yanking on spines and yanking on sacrums and doing all kinds of things. Oh, turkey. Oh my gosh, Thanksgiving meal, right? You know what I mean? But like distended bellies that thing's constantly pulling on them. And so now everything's going to shift that way. Talk about energy leaks. They don't have that under control, which is why you should be talking with your clients about digestion and do they have digestive issues or food allergies above and beyond the nutritional part. But that stuff's going to throw off your ability to be able to manage some of the stuff you're trying to control if that thing's constantly being pushed. Spinning wildly. That's a picture of the liver. So the liver does this. Okay, it's the most mobile organ in our body. And it doesn't, and the studies they've done on livers for cancer treatments, because if they're going to be doing, cancer treatments, they want to make sure they get it where it belongs. The liver doesn't return to the same location, and about 20%, I'm sorry, only about 20% of the population does it return to the same starting position. Things moving all over the place. And it's right up underneath that diaphragm. So it's constantly being pushed and rotated. It's the second heaviest organ in our body. That thing is constantly pulling of us. Some people on Saturday morning, that thing's heavy, right? That thing's trying to diffuse a lot of Friday night's activities. But no. But that being said, the stomach is a good representation of that as well too. The stomach has this shape to it. Guess how it started? It started like that. And during fetal development is where it's spun on this axis. And the mesentery spun on this axis and settled into place now. I read a study 2 days ago that talked about the attachment of the gluteus medius and the iliacus. Used to be right on top of each other, and then torque of the femur made them change their insertions on the femurs during fetal development, right around 8 to 12 weeks. So we're constantly torquing, not twerking, torquing. And then again, another representation of kind of what's happening with some of the organs inside, and that rotational piece that those black arrows are showing. That, in my mind, and other colleagues' mind, is what we're trying to control, in particular during certain movements. Okay, so this is a thing I have at my house. I kind of like it because I think it does a nice job of representing gait. Boom, boom. And if you'll notice, it's not the same on both sides. One side's a little heavier than the other. Because guess what? If it was balanced, it wouldn't work that well. Okay, we need this. This is super important, all these little things that I'm talking about in terms of torques and imbalances. So pressure, tension, and torque. So this combination allows for propulsion at its most minimal to maximal abilities. I'm running way over. You sure you're good with this? Okay. If anybody has to leave, I'm sorry about that. I think he's going to record it and he'll make it available to you. I get wordy. Sorry about that. It feeds athletics and what allows the system to create power. So Fibonacci spirals, Fibonacci, I mean, I have an article on it on my website. It's kind of cool. Fibonacci was like super cool. Not quite as cool as Da Vinci, but super cool. Developed our numeric system. Anyway, these Fibonacci spirals, this one right here, I'm trying to show from a standpoint of how it relates to our environment, okay? And how he's using the ground and rotating his arms and his legs to create that propulsive capabilities that he needs to be able to push and strive and drive off that ground. And that spiraling mechanism is happening by him pushing the ground out from underneath him. It's helical, and it creates potential and kinetic energy based upon each time he's hitting the ground and then pushing away. But there's also an internal one, like we've talked about. There's this diaphragm pumping. There's this pelvic floor pumping. There's these guts and organs that are trying to do this as he's going from side to side that he's got to contain. He needs it. He wants it. But he doesn't want it to be too out of hand or he'll lose that form that he's got. So there's these internal ones and there's these external ones to kind of keep in mind as you're playing with things. There's a client of mine, she's a figure skater. Whoop, sorry about that. Let me go back here. Whoop, what's going on? Just a good example of movement following the flow, okay? And how as she moves, she's spinning, she spins, she'll spin. She's following that procession we talked about, okay? She's rotating. Now, not all figure skaters rotate this way, but most of them do. I work with a lot of dancers as well, same type of thing. They'll rotate a certain direction more easily than others, right down to her tuck, okay? So just a good idea what can happen in terms of like athletics and movement and spins and how, people who do terrain park stuff, or you see these people do really cool things. This picture of my son, it's a great shot. I mean, the colors are really cool. It's a cool stop action sequence. It was like 10 years ago, he was super young. But look at this axis he created himself. So his axis is from right all through there. Okay, every single thing he's got going there is that axis through there, allowing that spin to occur, but he's got it under control, just enough to stick the landing, but that's why people overshoot the mark sometimes. Here's a good example of like twisting three-dimensionally, multi-planes. Boom, boom, boom. Of course, your pants have to be on fire, but super cool shot. And then run into the garage and have a hooded guy with a fire extinguisher put you out. But same kind of spin, same kind of rotational element. He learned how to capture that and utilize it for that really cool thing that he was doing there. So left unchecked, mismanaged, or poorly adapted to, this spiraling helicking component can create energy leaks where these forces have now found a new outlet. Ingrained mechanisms, patterns, previous injury, trauma, repetitive actions can further ingrain this. And you've seen it all the times with the clients and the patients that we work with, as well as ourselves. We do certain things, certain ways all the time because it feels natural. Now it's stuck in there, and kind of help to break some of those so that they're not quite so dominant and managing the way that we move is what we're trying to do. So the development of a spiral is often attributed to the core of the spiral, selecting the temporal and spatial evolution of the outward traveling wave. So again, Slinky is a nice little representation of that. When spirals can be attributed to a different mechanism acting away from the spiral's core, so let's say I've captured it and I've stabilized it, but now let's say I've got a little element, I got a leak, I got something not contained, everything else is contained. It's called, I think, spiral defect chaos. I found that because I really liked it and I use it. It actually refers more to convection and knitting, honestly. But I like it because in a picture of a spiral, if you've got something that's not under control, it's chaotic. They got a defect of some kind. Now they've got to figure out a strategy, a compensation to be able to navigate that. This picture right here, I'm going to demonstrate now, this video, is a woman, I'm a creep, I took a picture of her, of that left arm just flailing. She's letting her guts just carry her. She's got a load on the right side. I'm not ignorant of that, but she wouldn't do it the same way on this side, I'm pretty sure. So she's following to what feels most natural to her to create that axis of force production. Guts gone wild, right? So she's just spinning those things, and that's a shoulder that she presents to the physical therapist with, or the doctor at, and saying, my shoulder's been bugging me. I don't know why. I didn't do anything. But it's sometimes these little things that are creating issues during the daytime that produce enough problems later on that it's a problem. So watch her left arm when she runs. So she's a collegiate soccer player. Right arm goes straight, left arm rotates out. Fast, strong player. But that left arm is constantly spinning her out every time. She had no idea. It wasn't until I showed her the video, and I was rehabbing her following an MCL injury, non-contact, a plant and a twist, right knee. Did that cause it? I don't know. But that chaotic element, if she's increasing the speed of that and the intensity of it, I can't help but think, created enough torsional element somewhere else that might have produced at least some of her vulnerability to that injury. So is compensation basically spiral defect chaos? A defect in the natural order of things, providing a blip in the flow, resulting in a change which, in an attempt to return to its natural path, merely further ingrains the strategy. Now they're compressing further up. Now they're compressing further down to try to rein in what's actually happening. They're bending sacrums, like I talked about with that girl earlier today, who's super mobile in her arms and her legs because she's trying to rein in all this excess motion that her brain and her body doesn't know how to navigate well. And, All right, so where's the compression? So pretty straightforward with this young man. Stance position. Society would tell him, you have good posture, okay? Because he's vertical. Ears over shoulder, shoulder over hips, hips over ankles. But he's pushed. Someone is at his low back pushing him. It's tipped. He's hanging on his hip flexors. My hip flexors are always tight. Of course they are. If they weren't tight, you'd fall over because he's hanging on them, okay? He's jutting his head back and his shoulders back because society told him, you got to stand up straight and pitch your shoulder blades back. So he was not in a position to be able to properly bring him back. So this just got tighter and I'm not blaming society. I'm just saying those are elements of things, of kinds of conversations I had with people that are kind of like, yeah, but I thought, yeah, but I was told. And then this other woman right here, like I talked about earlier, someone's pushing her from the front, someone's pushing her from the back. And so now she's compensated differently. She's all rolled. So she's taken this and shoved it down even further. She's got to open up. He's got to close down in places. I hope you can kind of see that. Now, these x-rays aren't of them, but just to kind of to demonstrate what happens internally. This is a whatever ideal is, but a pretty balanced position of a diaphragm where it's that nice dome shape, kind of balanced front to back-ish. You can see the shadow of the right versus the left, demonstrating their different positions, different orientations, different heights. Perfect, awesome, not a big deal. But how someone, and you can see this more sway back position this person's in, and how that change of that angle of that diaphragm is now during inhalation is in this position. Every time she's taking a breath is yanking her further, yanking her further back and down into that position. And if she goes to see a person, I don't want to blame the field, because of shoulder issues, they'll keep retracting and retracting and retracting. So visually assessing, so adapting to torque. So this is a high-level cross-country runner. I think it's a Gatorade athlete of the month or something, super good. But he's adapted to his torque. He's very, very competitive. But he's got issues, okay? He's got down on one side. He's got a different slope on his right shoulder versus his left. You can see that the space between his right arm and his left is a little different. The height of his right arm and his left arm is a little different. Orientation of right leg versus left leg different. One's locked, one's not. I mean, all these these little areas that he's created spins in different parts of his body for him to be able to run. I watched him run, went away. It's a beautiful runner. His life day to day, he's got issues. Make sense? So he adapted to his torque, made him very successful at it. But his day-to-day life needed adjustments. This is not adapting to torque. This is a hockey player who walks like he plays, right? Very good hockey player, okay? I'm blowing smoke up all these people. Hey, you're all great athletes, but he is. He's very competitive, but he's not adaptive. He's walking like he plays. I use this woman right here on the right. I've used her for a long time in videos. She did not know that her right arm did not move when she walked. True story. She goes, yeah, someone told me once they didn't think my arm moved much when I walked. She's like hemiplegic, you know what I mean? So they don't know all the time. You'd think they'd know, but they don't. And so sometimes you bring things to people's attention, or they get stuck in a medical model that says, true story, patellofemoral pain strengthen the VMO. Then they get stuck in a medical model that doesn't look at a system. Adapting athletics, what do I mean by that? So if you ignore the tape, level shoulders, pretty even slopes, neck looks pretty good, elbows look pretty good. You know what I mean? Nothing really jumping out. But I wanted to tape the bottom of her scapula because she's a former LPGA golfer who adapted for her athletics because her body figured out a way. I got to be in position for my setup. I got to get myself to a position and then constantly over time develop these adaptive compensations. Other people do it for aesthetics. She's a jazz musician. She's got 4 or 5 albums out. She does it because stage presence and being at the piano. So she's got the same type of element of the change in scapular position. But if you looked at her, you'd be like, man, you're spot on, level, even. But that adaptation she needed because of the aesthetics aspect of things. And so sometimes the behavioral things that I talked about are really matter. This is a behavior of protecting a lumbar spine that's bothered her for a long time because she had 2, I'll just say rehab practitioners, doesn't matter the field, tell her, don't bend your spine, it's bad for your spine. That's why your back hurts. So Alex will clarify that. I'm sure some of you I know already know what that's all about, but that's a spine that can't flex. And if we looked at an x-ray of that, that would be an x-ray that the spine is in a extended position. The front are open, the back are closed. It cannot flex. So I did not want her flexing. She's not ready to flex until we balance off her pressures, until we create tension in the areas that she needs to create tensions in to be able to create the internal mechanism change that allows that expansion to occur for proper flexion. Someone overshot the mark. So now we've got over rounding in that area. So you weight trained a lot, super nice guy. You'd like to lift heavy, but had these internal, we can get into ISAs, we can talk about all kinds of stuff that there was, but just his compensation for a body that was broad like this created this really overexpansive element towards his backside. We're making good progress. We're getting better lumbar flexion. We're getting better upper dorsal thoracic expansion. getting him to learn to kind of scapular position himself a little bit differently to not allow that to blow out through his energy leak. This guy runs to his midline. And so I watched him run. It's like 1 foot in front of the other. It's like he's running on a line. So he was like this in his pelvis and lower rib cage. Trail runs multi-miles, likes doing long distance races in the woods, love it. But he's like this. And his upper body's really wide, okay? Because his lower body was overcompressed. Whatever, 3-4 weeks later, yeah, I said, go and don't think. So just, he went, he had been thinking about it a little bit when he's in the trails, opened him up a little bit, gave him more movement options through his pelvis and his hips, created expansion where he needed it. Now he's got a little better balance of his stride and his stance to be able to create a better gait, which, you know, these are the subtle things to kind of look for. I was on the phone this morning with a tennis coach. Same thing, like, I am not telling you tennis, please. But I'm telling you what she's doing is wreaking havoc on her spine. And let me tell you why. When you explain it to them respectfully, then you have conversations, guess what? Now you've got good communication. And now they've got things that they can look at, and you probably have another person to refer to you. Okay, following form, that's a form of compressed, pitched, upright, strong guy, likes to lift heavy, likes to, ready everybody, likes to back squat. Okay, so again, pretty straightforward. I'll kind of keep going. You kind of see what's going on there. He's just following what his body does. So some interventions. Capturing the front. So this is not everybody, and some of you I know know good assessments and good interventions and where to put them and why. Alex will help clarify some of those elements with some of your mentoring, which is awesome. I like to go, I'm going after this first. I'm going after getting this anterior wall to be able to create a front canister that's going to contain it. Some of them already have it. Some of them are over canistered on the front and over abdominalized. You know what I mean? They've got it. That's not what I'm going after. I'm skipping that and going after the next thing. Okay. But this first piece for a lot of people is what I want to get. Their ability to create an integrated abdominal wall. And whatever other fancy words we want to call that, we can call it. Ventilatory variability, create a zone of apposition, get abdominal, you know, all of that stuff. I want this to be able to get abdominals that are smart, abdominals that can maintain concentric ability to pull a rib cage down in a pelvis and keep it there, maintain eccentric control to keep the guts in place, to control the spin and the orientation, have them be able to utilize it while they're doing movements and exercise at the same time. Sometimes I'll manipulate breath into a certain direction as a result of it, but that's what I'm going after first. Once they get that element, then I want to kind of get the back to open up a little bit, assuming they don't have back opening. So that top picture is it's a kind of an all fours quadruped position. It's a modified all four belly lift, depending upon, you know, what principle you want to use. This right here is an all four belly lift where she's lifting her right arm up off the ground, and lifting her right arm up off the ground is not doing this. It's doing this. It's capturing that rib cage to get it to roll back to maintain that anterior abdominal wall position, to get her to be able to then expand in the directions that are different. And usually at this stage, if I'm having them do this, they're doing both sides, because I'm working on both sides and control of both sides. These are kind of in some degree of order. You know, the first guy is a little more constrained. He's got, you know, multiple points of contact, a little lower threshold activity. Second one, higher threshold. Now we go a little bit more upright, a little supported. This guy needs back expansion. So now I got bands around his arms to give him a little bit more abdominal integration, a little more ability to kind of pull that wall down on the front, so that when he goes to inhale, that diaphragm's over and on top of him. The ball is helping to keep that pelvic position underneath him well positioned, as well as femoral heads. And at the same time, he's getting to get good back expansion. And it's got his butt up against the wall so that he doesn't cheat, because his body will cheat if he didn't have some degree of support. Is this the only thing I would have him do if I was training him? No. Might I start him with this and then go to do something on top of it? Absolutely. Some are twisted. And so, as I talked about, if things going like this or going like that, or whatever element they're creating, some people have to create something to contain it. So she's doing this because when she inhales, her system really does this twist. So her left arm is internally rotated. She's pushing it into her guts. Pushing it into her rib cage. Her right arm is more externally rotated and out. She can't push it out there. Fist is in the way. That's got to go back, because one side needs to go back. As she's exhaling, squeezing it back further, bringing her shoulder blades back. Container control for asymmetry. I'm doing it supine. Bands, imbalanced, decreased right thoracic wall opening. Need a little better left abdominal wall control. Band behind me, this position. I've taken a rib cage that was like this, flared on the right, pushed forward on the left, and bringing it into a position where now it's a little bit more balanced, just adding a little bit of resistance. Get them up. Use hands. Side bend. Same kind of presentation. Now it's a little more challenging. Feet on the ground. Heels are pulling into the box to keep that pelvis underneath her. Pull apart. Retraction. ER. Drop it down. Pull it back. And you see the similarity between all three pictures. Just a little different level of activity. If I lose people, let me know. Do it in the questions. Sorry, give me a second here. Make sure my time, because I got a 4 o'clock client. Great. So this guy right here, now we're challenging his abdominal wall. He's got pretty good control in his arms are here. We're working more upright without him losing that good anterior abdominal wall, and still working at the same time kind of dorsal rostral or posterior mediastinal expansion. So now his scapula in that position are being challenged because now they're getting more into this internally rotated position, but I don't want to have it give and cave. In my mind, when I have someone weight bearing on arms, the direction that they're pushing is driving the expansion in the opposite direction. That's kind of how I look at it. So if I got arms kind of going at 90 degrees, air's kind of going back. If I got arms going down, it's kind of going up and back. If I got arms behind me like this, air's being expansions being driven in that opposite direction. So I'll get people into positions for exercise that I'll put them in to try and help to kind of supplement what it is I'm trying to do. They have a hard time controlling the front, get something to block it. I use balls a lot. She can't expand. She's got to get the back. She's pulling on her arms. Those arms are yanking those intercostals, oblique muscles. She's actively, as she's flexing, she's inhaling. So she's teaching her hamstrings to learn to maintain pelvic control during inhalation, holding that position. Super integrated activity. I think she has a weight between her ankles, so she's squeezing it together to get good adduction at the same time, control that pelvic outlet. I don't know why this does this sometimes, sorry gang. Love you, TJ, go away. Thank you, okay. Compression with expansion with alternation. So again, some of these things, some of you who have taken posture restoration courses, some of these are based off some of those posture restoration exercises, which is great material to learn. It's also based upon just general physiological principles of expansion and compression, areas that you want to kind of drive positions to help allow the body to change. So whatever model you want to look at it, they're all fantastic. So this person right here, I'm getting to use both sides. So offset position, take a couple breaths, walk up, opposite position, take a couple breaths, kind of walks up and down, and then rest for a second, and then he does it dynamically. Steps up, steps down, steps up, steps down, and deliberately exaggerates the push each time. Now I'm pushing the very mechanism that I kind of set into place with that first set, where he does walk-ups and walk-downs. That's what that's demonstrating. Is there a video on that? Yeah, so here he is. Boom, boom, driving through the rib cage, driving through the rib cage, driving through the arms. Obviously, someone in the background, so pre-COVID times. Compressing, expanding, challenging. This isn't the best example of it, it's just happened to be the one that I have. I have an activity series I call triplanar extension activity, or TP. And so she gets there. I'll often have heels up against the wall, but she has to stay vertical with her arms, drives through bent left hip extension, brings the arm up into flexion. So it's triplane extension activity because she's got to control her body dying to go into extension everywhere. So as that hip goes in towards extension, that arm goes towards flexion, that's her body sprinting basically with all the right musculature. This really does a great job. They hold it for a few breaths. Like, it really challenges the system pretty dynamically. I usually start them on elbows, knees, elbows, toes, you know what I mean? So I kind of work them up through a leveled sequence that works really well. If I'm grounding them, I mean, tripod foot, I think people are familiar with. It's a great concept that's in the kind of the rehab world, and I think it's a good idea to use context to have people sense and feel. I mean, I kind of made the word quadruped up just because I like that element too, because I think that really captures the ground that much more. So I'm like, here's your 4 points of contact. Now they've got grounding. Now, if I'm doing it dynamically, I still work off of that element. But to me, that's that max contact point ability where I'm trying to manage, use, but control supination to pronation to supination movement, where you can use that little mechanism, that network of lines that you see to allow the body to be able to kind of turn and grasp and ground themselves most effectively. So he's using that element with this activity. It's not video, but he's grounding, pushing, moving through the rib cage. Is his pelvis moving? Yeah, I'm not about to stabilize it unless I feel like he can't control it. But I'm allowing that pelvis to move and rotate a little bit when he does things. Because now I want him feeling like he's fluid, like he's moving through the ground with that piece. Here's his, I call heel diggers, elbows a little bit bent. She needs expansion. So she's breathing in this position, keeps the scapular position in control, long-headed tricep, doing a nice job of positioning that scapula, digging on heels. She did it dynamically. She's holding for 2 breaths afterwards at the end, just to kind of tie it in. I cue them when they do this exercise, and like, hang on a sec. Dig on the left heel, dig on the right heel, dig on the left heel. That's the cue that really drives tricep, scapular, hamstring, pelvis position above and beyond, lift and lower, because they'll try to push through the bottom of their heel versus pull through the back of their heel when they do this activity. So you could, she's chatted, but so good activity. She's exhaling down to keep concentric activity abdominal wall. She's coming up and keeping it during inhalation. You can reverse it if you're looking for something different. I'll have people come, inhale down, exhale up, inhale down, exhale up, depending upon where I'm trying to get the body to be able to kind of create different movement. So compensating. So here's someone who I set up. I like this for tripod rows. Like heels up against the wall, one hand there, set up, push through the arm, feel the load, set the rib cage, and then watch his back. Boop! He goes back to what he knows. So he goes right back into that thoracic extension. Now keep that, Todd, keep that. That's a very different exercise for him to feel that control. Now he's got this. He positioned his serratus in the right position, and now reset your ribs one more time. Bring them up towards the ceiling. And that's how I cue him. I hope that helps. That's hard because he's dying to go back to what he knows. Now, at the time, caught him. At the time, I was seeing him pretty regularly. I wouldn't have him do that on his own because of how easily he would cheat until I felt like he nailed it with repeated visits with me. All right, so a lot of constraints, but a challenging activity. Josh Henkin, DVRT sandbags, talks a lot about tension, talks a lot about pulling. So I have him pulling that apart. I'm going after abdominals, going after serratus positioners, going after traps and rhomboid muscles. Other people will cue other muscles that they're going after, like lats and stuff like that. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but I want them here to do this as he's going overhead. He's a basketball player and a baseball player. So he needed that overhead control. At the same time, I'm trying to challenge a single leg activity with him. And I hope you can hear with my cueing that sometimes I'm like dialoguing with him at the same time. Why does this keep doing this? There we go. So now we're capturing it with pressure. So now, this right here is a good example of pulling it, engaging it, same woman as before. This position. Had a client in this morning. It's a great representation. She's very stuck in her ability to be able to rotate and flex on both sides evenly. So as I did a marching activity with her, I just changed her breathing. I said, okay, as you go up with your right, I want to have you inhale. As you go up with your left, I want to have you exhale. Inhale, exhale, because I needed to get that right side to be able to flex better. And I needed that left side to create more that right side to expand better. And I need that left side to contract better. So I just had her do that. I did table test before. I had her do it. I checked after. I had her do it the other way. It pulled her back out of place. So she could see the difference. So sometimes you can bias the breath with just a simple activity and realize like, oh my gosh, yeah, your table flexion measures or your tibial IRE or whatever can change right away. So here's someone, loading, capture the front, lunge walk, capture the front, lunge walk, really loading that quadruped foot, controlling, positioning as he goes up and down. So other benefits, other bennies of managing pressure, tension, autonomics, of course, we all know that. So there's parasympathetic stuff that you're managing all the time with this, just as I talked about at the beginning of the talk. Stress management, same thing. I use breathing all the time to have people kind of rein their systems back in mentally, physically, emotionally. Recovery and sleep, again, last client I just saw, we talked about it from a sleep perspective. Here's your going to sleep activity, and here's how I want to have you do it. General sense of well-being, the compliance that I get with my clients is really very good for two reasons. One, I want them feeling different after I give them an activity to do. That's just it. I want them to feel like they're motivated at home because they feel better. Two is a benefit because they're paying the cash to come see me and they're having problems. But, but that being said, I want to have people feel different. I don't want to give them something to do. Say, do this for 2 weeks and hopefully that'll help you feel better. I want them to kind of sense a difference right away. I want to have an increased tolerance to daily activities. Improve immune response, huge, you bet. The better ability you're creating capacity of that pulmonary structures to do what they're supposed to do, you're in a much better position to be able to fight off and ward off things, including breathing through this thing all the time to maintain that suction capability. Allowing for integration of all the systems, that's my name of my business, integrated rehab training. I want the systems to be able to kind of all play nice together. So in summation, can you feel the pressure? Appreciate the elements that feed into imbalanced pressures among all the systems. Introduce concepts that manage these pressures to decrease compensation, energy leaks, and chaos. Great word. Can you handle the tension? Respect internal tensional properties and try to invoke change to best manage them. How these things are constantly trying to kind of pull or strain against each other, or in a good way, how to create that surface tension to allow slide and glide to occur. Optimizing surface tension qualities through interventions to allow for ideal movement expression. So that's enough.
That was awesome, Mike.
Well, how that work out okay?
Yeah, that was amazing. Really good. It's cool because a lot of people are kind of thinking in that thought process, but what I really like about how you describe it is you describe it as, hey, there's all these different systems out there. Everybody is saying similar things, but this is how this relates to all these different fields as well. I mean, you started with a physics standpoint, and then you integrate it with, this is what you're going to see from a postural standpoint, and then how you integrate exercises based on that. So it's really cool. And
thank you.
Very well said.
Thank you. I sense looking at your mentorship thing, and like we discussed when you asked me what to talk about, you'll go through the more specific assessments. I just thought I'd put some visual things up and some of the elements that feed into sometimes why people make these decisions as to how they end up in the positions that they are. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's great because we talked about assessment this week, and it's cool because we have a Slack group which we're all going to be assessing each other over the next couple of weeks. And nice. So this is going to add this other element into, what to look for when people are posting these pictures. So that's really cool. But yeah, no, does anybody have any questions for Mike?
I love it when I'm so comprehensive, I answer every question. Matt, you're going to say something, man.
I'm just going to like listening to the level of which you speak at. I think you capture so many elements to the entirety of the human system that it's just great to listen to, and just kind of instills a wondering that I need to go explore more and get to deeper levels to even comprehend some of it. So that's I just like listen to the way you speak and the way you touch on so many different various points and bring it, but holistically bring it all back together. That's the beauty of it.
Thanks, I appreciate that. It means a lot. I have spent just a quick side note, an environment that I was in for a long time as my whole thought process was changing dramatically from 2000 when I took a new position in Maine over the next 10 to 15 years. was a dramatic shift. And it's such a positive way, I can't even tell you. I was learning great stuff when I was in San Francisco and all that, but my job during that time was in an environment that was not supportive of everything that I did. So I became, I had to become way better at being able to talk in multiple languages. Do you know what I mean? To decipher things that makes it sound applicable and not threatening, create context for people who don't understand the other elements, but not make it so over their heads that it sound like I'm, you know what I mean? Like I'm too haughty. So I hope that, to your point, that it's not too much, it's not too over the head, but that it's presented in a way that it's absorbable, at least for the most part. Like anybody I listen to, I go back and listen and take notes again, but you know, I never want to feel like I'm talking at a level where it's not almost immediately applicable to stuff that you've seen or stuff that you can do. So, but thank you, Matt. That means a lot.
Yeah, we spoke about that a little bit this summer when we were talking about like challenges I have at my current work position, and same kind of thing. So I'm still like in putting stuff together to try to, I mean, we haven't been back to work since March, so we haven't been able to apply any of it as a group, but
yeah, no, I remember the
working
conversation.
towards it.
Yeah. Anyone else? We good? Yeah.
I said, all right, no, Lisa, you talk. It's all you.
Hi, Michael. This is the first encounter I've had with you, and I really, really appreciated your excitement when you went through the human body and kind of those pictures that you had in the beginning, because I share that same enthusiasm, and I really appreciated how you mixed everything together and how well and how thorough you were with every bit of information. So I think that it applied to us exactly the way we need it right now.
Yeah, thank you. It means a lot. And I'm glad you appreciate the excitement that I have, because it's like I've been doing this a long time, and my wife and I'll chuckle sometimes. I'm like, I just make it stop sometimes. Just stop, you know, because you just constantly think of new ways of doing things, or explaining something to a client, or someone you saw and you're like you didn't have an answer, or you had an idea and they're like, oh, then it kind of comes to you. And, and I get excited with every single person I see, because they're fun, you know, and to be in an environment, or let me phrase that, to be with a group of people like you're with that are all equally excited and learning great stuff that's along this vein is where I think the industry needs to go. And I know of people that are doing these types of thought processes that are, I don't care what their license is. I send people to them because they'll do a better job than some of these people with fancy licenses. You know what I mean? Just because they're going to integrate more of what the system needs, in my mind, than being myopic and looking at, you know, that knee problem that they have. So, yeah, to that point, you're with the right group. So thank you very much for saying something.
And I think that helps put it into context too, that even if you do use maybe some wordage that people would not normally understand, that excitement alone gets them excited along with you. And it's, yeah. So.
And the more you learn this, you're so welcome. The more you learn this stuff, I mean, I keep alluding to my day, because I think if I talk about like, hey, this is what I saw today, like it brings it back to reality. The last person I just saw loves to learn this stuff. Like he's all in, like he wants to hear the dialogue. He's like, when I hear all this stuff, it makes so much, it explains things. I know what I'm doing more, versus other people that are just kind of like, you see them start to kind of glaze over a little bit, you know what I mean? And you're kind of like, okay, so here's what we need to do now. And then you just kind of go on, and then you kind of start to stack it on with them over time. I literally have clients that I had one last week. I've worked with her for, I don't even know, 2.5 years. And she's moving great and has been for a long time. But she said to me this past week, I think I'm finally getting it. Like it's finally clicking like this. And I'm like, you've been moving great. You're like, you're feeling good. You're not having problems. She goes, no, I know that. But now I'm understanding more. Now it's finally settling in. So sometimes it just takes repetition, you know, just the right verbiage at the right time, you know, whatever it is for it to finally sink in for some people, even though they're demonstrating significant improvements overall and feeling better.
Yep, exactly.
I feel like now I know what it feels like when you have long hair. I keep like waving my things. Almost, Matt, almost.
Definitely.
Yeah, I haven't touched it since stopped work. So it's been 8 months of slow growth, and it's too much. It's got to go. I told myself I was going to cut it right before we got back to working with people in person, and that just hasn't happened yet. So.
Excellent. I ran way over again. I'm sure you said give me as much time as I want, but so I really appreciate everybody, taking the time with me today and spending the whole time. I know a couple people might have had to leave early, but as you're taking this information in, I mean, you'll have access to it. I'm sure from Alex will send the recording and send it to you. Do not hesitate. I answer a lot of emails, so don't hesitate to send me an email if there's other points that you want clarification on, further readings or other stuff that might be helpful for any of you along the way. I'm happy to help. So,
yeah, Mike, thanks so much for sharing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. You'll probably see me in your mentorship, just because, like, I think that's the thing, right? Like, you'll never know everything, and just to be able to hear different people's perspectives. And, I feel like I learn the most from communicating with clients, just being able to speak to them in a way that they understand. And then you kind of say something, you're like, oh yeah, you know what? That was actually pretty well said. And then that's when you start to put things together yourself, because we can get into the weeds with all this stuff, but we always have to get back into the fact that we have to be able to communicate it appropriately. So I really appreciate you coming on, and I will send you a recording of this as well, just so
awesome.
you.
Thank you.
And
awesome.
Yeah, and everybody who's going to be watching this after, feel free to reach out to Mike, and he's very generous with his time. And Mike, thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Great to see everybody. Be safe. Cheers.
Yeah.